What Russian pilots said when they first encountered the F-15 over Syria was not broadcast over any official frequency. It was not published in any government press release. It was not shared at any international aviation summit. It traveled the way most uncomfortable truths travel in military circles. Quietly, between professionals who understood exactly what they were looking at and who knew that what they were looking at demanded a serious response. And what they said, what they reported back to their commanders, what filtered through Russian Air Force debriefs, and eventually made its way into changed tactics, new procedures, and altered training doctrine, tells you more about the true balance of air power over that contested Syrian sky than any official statement ever could. Because pilots do not lie to each other. Not about this, not when their lives depend on getting it right. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand the real story behind what happens in the world's most dangerous airspace, subscribe right now. Most people watching this will not subscribe. Do not be most people. Hit that button and stay with us, because this story goes deep. Syria became something the world had not seen in decades. It became a live laboratory, a place where the most advanced military hardware on the planet, from multiple different nations with completely different doctrines, completely different philosophies about air warfare, completely different ideas about what a fighter jet is supposed to do and how it is supposed to do it, all showed up in the same piece of sky at the same time. And they had to figure out how to coexist. Or not. The Russians arrived in Syria in September of 2015. They came in strength. They came with Su-30SMs, Su-34s, Su-24s, Su-25s, and eventually Su-35s. They set up at Kamimim Air Base near Latakia. They established a presence that was meant to signal something very specific to the world, and most importantly, to the United States and its coalition partners, who were already operating in Syrian airspace. The signal was this: Russia is back. Russia is a first-tier military power again. Russia is operating sophisticated, modern, capable aircraft in a contested environment, and you will have to deal with us as equals. The Americans and their coalition partners were already there. They had been flying missions over Syria since 2014, under Operation Inherent Resolve. And among the assets they were operating, the ones that would end up mattering most to the story we are telling today, were F-15C Eagles and F-15E Strike Eagles, aircraft that had been in the American inventory for decades, aircraft that had a record that needed no introduction to anyone who flew fighters for a living. When Russian pilots operating in that environment first began encountering F-15s up close, not in a textbook, not in a simulation, not in an intelligence briefing, but in real airspace with real consequences, what happened next became one of the most significant and least publicized chapters in the story of modern air warfare. Let us start at the beginning. Let us talk about what the F-15 actually is, because you need to understand what these Russian pilots were looking at when they looked out of their cockpits and saw that aircraft sharing their sky. The F-15 Eagle was designed in the late 1960s and early 1970s in response to a very specific and very frightening problem. American pilots in Vietnam were discovering that the tactical and technological assumptions they had built their air force around were wrong. The belief that missiles had made the dogfight obsolete. The belief that radar-guided weapons had eliminated the need for close-range maneuvering combat. All of it had collapsed in the skies over Vietnam. American fighters were trading against North Vietnamese MiGs at ratios that were deeply alarming to the people responsible for maintaining American air superiority. Something had to change. The answer was the F-15. The design philosophy behind it was absolute and uncompromising. The F-15 would be built for one purpose and one purpose only. It would achieve and maintain air superiority. Everything else was secondary. Every pound saved, every bit of thrust added, every advance in avionics and radar, all of it pointed in one direction. No ground attack mission, no multi-role compromise. Just a pure, dedicated, supremely capable air superiority fighter. The motto written into its development was not a piece of marketing. It was an engineering directive. Not a pound for air to ground. What emerged from that process was an aircraft with a thrust-to-weight ratio that, in clean configuration, exceeded 1-to-1. That means it can accelerate while pointing straight up. It has a maximum speed well above Mach 2.5. Its APG-63 radar, and later significantly upgraded variants, was at the time of its introduction the most capable fire control radar fitted to any production fighter in history. It could carry a mix of AIM-7 Sparrow medium-range missiles, AIM-9 Sidewinder short-range missiles, and an internal 20mm cannon. Later versions would carry the AIM-120 AMRAAM, which represented a generational leap in beyond visual range engagement capability. The F-15 entered service in 1976, and from the moment it entered operational use, it began building a record that is, in the most literal sense, undefeated. As of every operational engagement on record, the F-15 has never been shot down in air-to-air combat, not once. Its air-to-air kill ratio across all operators stands above 100 kills to 0 losses. 100 to 0. In any arena of human competition, a record like that demands respect. In the arena of air combat, where the stakes are survival, that record is something that every pilot who flies against it or alongside it has to reckon with. Russian pilots knew this record. They studied it. Their intelligence services had collected every scrap of open source and classified information available about the F-15's capabilities. Their training doctrine included assessments of how to fight it, how to survive against it, what its weaknesses might be. On paper, in a classroom, in a simulator, they had a framework for understanding what the F-15 was. And then they met it in person, over Syria. The airspace over Syria in 2015 and 2016 was unlike anything that had existed since the Cold War ended. You had coalition aircraft, primarily American, operating under an established set of procedures. You had Russian aircraft operating under their own command structure. You had the theoretical possibility, and on several occasions the near actual reality, of these two sets of aircraft ending up in very close proximity, with very different objectives and very different rules of engagement. The potential for miscalculation was extraordinary. The potential for a single incident to escalate into something catastrophic was real enough that both sides established a direct military communication channel specifically to reduce that risk. That communication channel, formally called the Memorandum of Understanding on Prevention of Flight Safety Incidents in the Conduct of Operations in Syria, went into effect in October of 2015, just weeks after Russia began its air campaign. The fact that it needed to be established so quickly tells you something about what the airspace was actually like during those early weeks. Within that environment, Russian and American pilots began accumulating direct experience with each other's aircraft and each other's behavior, not through intelligence reports, not through analysis, through actual encounters, actual sensor data, actual observation of what the other aircraft could do when it was operating in the same piece of sky. The F-15C, the pure air superiority variant, was flying combat air patrol missions. Its job was exactly what it had always been: establish and maintain air superiority. Be present, be capable, be ready. When Russian aircraft began operating in that same airspace, the F-15Cs were there, and what Russian pilots observed during those encounters began filtering back into the Russian Air Force in ways that would eventually reshape how Russia thought about tactical air warfare. Let us talk about what they observed. The first thing, the thing that hits you before anything else when you encounter an F-15 in a real operational environment, is the radar. The F-15's radar does not announce itself the way a pilot briefed on electronic warfare expects. In a training environment, in a classroom, you learn about the AIM APG-63, or the later AIM APG-70 and APG-82 systems in terms of their specifications, range, resolution, modes. You understand it intellectually. What you are not fully prepared for is the experience of being tracked by it in a real environment, where you are not the one controlling the exercise. Multiple accounts from pilots who have encountered or flown against the F-15's radar system in real environments describe a similar experience. The system's ability to maintain track, to burn through jamming, to sort targets in a complex electromagnetic environment, performs at a level that creates an immediate and profound tactical disadvantage for the aircraft being targeted. Russian electronic warfare systems were assumed, by Russian doctrine and Russian assessment, to be capable of significantly degrading American radar capability. What those assumptions did not fully account for was the difference between degrading a system and defeating it. The F-15's radar, particularly in the upgraded variants operating over Syria, could be degraded. It could not be reliably defeated. This mattered enormously, because Russian tactical doctrine for engaging advanced Western fighters leaned heavily on the assumption that electronic warfare would level the playing field at beyond visual range distances. The idea was that if you can disrupt the enemy's ability to track you and guide weapons at you from beyond visual range, you force the engagement into closer ranges where the characteristics of your own aircraft, the Su-35's exceptional maneuverability, its high angle of attack capability, its thrust vectoring, its close-range weapons, become decisive. You take away the American advantage in beyond visual range combat and substitute an environment where Russian training and Russian aircraft design philosophy might produce better outcomes. That theory ran directly into the operational reality of the F-15 over Syria. And the collision between theory and reality is where the assessments that changed Russian tactics began. The second thing Russian pilots began reporting was the F-15's energy management. This sounds technical, and it is, but the implications are visceral. Energy management in fighter combat refers to the ability to maintain and convert between kinetic energy, your speed, and potential energy, your altitude, in a way that preserves your tactical options. A fighter that manages its energy well can choose the terms of an engagement. It can accelerate when it needs to close distance. It can climb when it needs altitude advantage. It can turn without bleeding so much speed that it becomes a slow, predictable target. A fighter that manages energy poorly finds itself boxed in, slow when it needs to be fast, low when it needs to be high, committed to a turn it cannot complete. The F-15's energy management, in the hands of experienced American pilots, was at a level that Russian aviators described in terms that make the gap very clear. The aircraft they were observing did not behave the way their assessments had suggested it would. The margins they had assumed existed, the windows of opportunity created by the F-15's supposed disadvantages in certain flight regimes, did not materialize the way they were supposed to. What they saw instead was an aircraft being flown with a level of precision and intentionality that left very little room for exploitation. Some of this was the aircraft. The F-15's aerodynamics, its massive wing area, its two enormously powerful engines, create a platform that is genuinely difficult to put in an energy-disadvantaged position if the pilot understands what they are doing. But some of it was the pilots. American F-15 pilots are the product of a training pipeline that is arguably the most demanding and the most realistic in the world. They fly against each other in dissimilar air combat training that uses actual adversary tactics. They fly against aggressor squadrons that specialize in replicating the tactics and flight characteristics of potential adversaries. They accumulate combat hours and training hours at a rate that creates a level of tactical fluency that is very difficult to replicate. When Russian pilots were observing F-15s operating over Syria, they were not just observing an aircraft, they were observing the product of decades of continuous refinement, continuous training, and continuous operational experience. That combination is harder to assess from the outside than raw performance specifications, and it created surprises. The third element of the Russian assessment involved what happened at the point of potential engagement geometry. In modern air combat, much of what determines the outcome of an encounter happens before a single weapon is fired. It happens in the geometry of the intercept. Who saw whom first? Who established a tracking solution first? Who put the other aircraft in a position where its defensive options were limited before the engagement began? This is sometimes called the first look, first shot, first kill problem, and it is at the center of every serious analysis of modern air combat. American doctrine, American training, American aircraft design, and American weapons systems have been optimized around this problem for decades. The investment in low observable technology, in advanced radar systems, in beyond visual range weapons like the AIM-120 AMRAAM, in data links that allow pilots to receive cueing information from other sensors before they ever turn their own radar on. All of it reflects a philosophy built around solving the first look, first shot, first kill problem in America's favor. You want to be the one who sees first. You want to shoot first. You want to kill first. You want the enemy pilot to never know you were there until it is too late. Over Syria, Russian pilots began accumulating evidence about how this played out in practice. The F-15s were operating with a degree of situational awareness that went beyond what their own onboard sensors could provide. They were receiving data from E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control aircraft, from ground-based radar systems, from other platforms in the network. Russian pilots flying modern aircraft with capable sensors were finding themselves in situations where the Americans clearly knew where they were, knew their heading, knew their altitude, and had established tactical positioning before any of the variables the Russian pilots expected to be able to exploit had even come into play. This is not a small thing. This is not a minor tactical detail. The ability to know where your adversary is before he knows where you are is not just an advantage. In modern air combat, it is frequently the decisive factor. The pilot who has that advantage chooses the terms of the fight. He decides whether to engage or not. He decides the geometry of the engagement. He decides whether the fight happens at long range or short range, at high altitude or low altitude, in a head-on geometry or from a rear quarter. The pilot without that advantage is reacting. He is playing defense from the moment the engagement begins. And in air combat, playing defense is an extremely difficult way to survive. Russian pilots were, in a meaningful number of the encounters they described, finding themselves in the defensive position before they had expected to be there. The margin of uncertainty they had assumed they would have, the buffer between detection and engagement, was smaller than they had counted on, sometimes significantly smaller. The assessments that came back from these encounters described the F-15 not just as a capable aircraft with impressive specifications, but as a system, an integrated package of sensors, weapons, data links, supporting platforms, and pilot training that operated in a way that was qualitatively different from what even detailed prior analysis had suggested. The whole was more than the sum of its parts. And the parts were already formidable. Now let us talk about the Su-35, because this is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. The Russian Air Force eventually deployed Su-35S fighters to Syria, beginning in late 2015 and expanding in 2016. The Su-35 is a serious aircraft. Let us be completely clear about that. It is not a second-tier system. It is not something that can be dismissed or minimized. The Su-35 is built on the Su-27 airframe, which was itself designed specifically to match or exceed the F-15 in air combat. The Soviet design bureau that created the Su-27 had access to enough intelligence about the F-15 program that they understood what they needed to build. They built something impressive. The Su-35 takes that foundation and adds to it substantially. It has thrust vectoring engines that give it maneuverability in regimes that are genuinely extraordinary. At very low speeds, at very high angles of attack, in the close-range maneuvering environment, the Su-35 can do things that virtually no other aircraft in the world can do. The Pugachev Cobra, the Kulbit, the tailslide, these are not just airshow tricks. They are demonstrations of a control authority at the edge of the flight envelope that has real tactical implications in within-visual range combat. If you can get an engagement into close range, if you can get it into a turning fight, the Su-35 becomes an extraordinarily dangerous adversary. The Su-35 also carries the Irbis-E radar, which is among the most powerful fighter radars in the world in terms of raw power output. It carries long-range air-to-air missiles, including the R-77, the Russian counterpart to the AIM-120 AMRAAM, and the R-37M, a very long-range missile designed specifically for targeting high-value assets like tankers and airborne warning and control aircraft. It has an infrared search and track system that provides a passive tracking capability independent of radar. On paper, it is a legitimate challenge to any Western fighter, including the F-15. What Russian pilots flying the Su-35 over Syria discovered, and what they reported, was that the gap between performance on paper and performance in the operational environment was larger than they had expected. Not because the Su-35 was performing below its specifications. The aircraft was doing what it was designed to do. The gap emerged from the context in which that performance was being applied. The F-15 and the American operational systems surrounding it were performing above what Russian assessments had predicted. The two phenomena together created a combined effect that was larger than either one alone would have been. The Irbis-E radar's exceptional power output is an example. Raw power in a radar is a meaningful capability, but it is also a signature. In a contested electromagnetic environment where the other side has sophisticated electronic support measures designed to detect, classify, and locate radar emissions, a radar that shouts very loudly is also a radar that is very easy to find. American electronic support systems, both on the F-15 itself and on supporting platforms, are specifically designed to exploit exactly this characteristic. The moment the Irbis-E transmits, it is creating information that American systems are collecting and processing. That information contributes to the situational awareness picture that was already giving American pilots advantages in positioning and engagement geometry. Russian pilots began recognizing this dynamic, the tactical calculus they had been operating under, the assumptions built into their procedures and their planning, had not fully accounted for how the American system would use their own emissions against them. And once you recognize that dynamic, Once you understand that your own active systems are contributing to the enemy's picture of where you are, your options narrow significantly. You either stop using those systems and operate blind, or you continue using them and accept that you are illuminating yourself. Neither option is comfortable. There is another dimension to this that the Russian assessment grappled with, and it goes beyond hardware and into something that is harder to quantify, but no less real. It goes into the question of experience. American fighter pilots have been flying combat missions continuously since 1991. Not theoretically, not in exercises, in actual combat, against actual adversaries, in actual contested environments. The Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. For over 3 decades, American tactical aviation has been engaged in continuous combat operations that have provided a constant feedback loop between doctrine, training, execution, and results. Lessons learned in 1991 were applied in 1999. Lessons from 1999 were applied in 2003. The process never stopped. Russian military aviation, for all its genuine capabilities, had a fundamentally different experience over that same period. The conflicts Russia fought, in Chechnya, in Georgia, in earlier phases of the Syrian engagement, were not the same kind of environment. They did not provide the same kind of continuous high-end feedback loop against sophisticated adversaries with advanced integrated air defense and air-to-air capabilities. The Su-35 pilots deploying to Syria in 2015 and 2016 were flying an excellent aircraft. But the total system they represented, aircraft plus pilot experience plus doctrine, refined by continuous combat feedback, was not equivalent to the total system the F-15 pilots represented, and the encounters over Syria began to make that gap visible in ways that were uncomfortable. One of the specific tactical changes that Russian Air Force doctrine underwent following the Syrian experience involved the management of beyond visual range engagements and the integration of electronic warfare with offensive action. Before Syria, Russian doctrine was relatively confident that electronic warfare support could sufficiently degrade American beyond visual range capability to force engagements into shorter range regimes where Russian aircraft could compete more effectively. After Syria, that confidence was revised. The revision was not a complete abandonment of the approach. It was a more sober assessment of what electronic warfare could realistically achieve against specific American systems, and a recalibration of the planning assumptions that fed into tactical decisions. The revision also touched on the question of formation tactics. Russian fighter formations operating over Syria began adjusting their geometry in ways that reflected the new understanding of American situational awareness capabilities. The spacing between aircraft, the altitude differentials, the timing of maneuvers, all of these were modified to make the task of building a complete picture more difficult for American sensors and the network supporting them. These are not the adjustments of a force that is satisfied with its performance. They are the adjustments of professionals who have looked honestly at what the experience revealed and decided that changes were necessary. There is a story that has circulated in defense and military aviation circles, documented to varying degrees by analysts and journalists covering the Syrian conflict, about a specific encounter between Russian aircraft and American F-15s that became something of a reference point in Russian internal discussions about the Syrian experience. The details of specific encounters are difficult to verify completely from open sources, and the Russian government was not in the business of publicizing anything that reflected unfavorably on its air force. But the pattern of what was reported by those close to the situation, by analysts with access to people who were there, paints a consistent picture. In encounters where F-15s were operating in their intended role, flying air superiority combat air patrol with the full support of the American Battle Management Network, Russian pilots found themselves in situations where the Americans had established dominant positioning before the Russian pilots had full clarity on the tactical situation. The margin that should have existed, the buffer that doctrine and planning had assumed, was not there, or it was smaller than expected. And in air combat, the difference between the margin you expected and the margin you actually have can determine whether you survive or not. Russian pilots are professionals. They are well trained. They fly capable aircraft. And like all true professionals, what they did with an uncomfortable experience was learn from it. The debriefs were serious. The assessments were honest. The conclusion was not that the F-15 was some kind of supernatural aircraft that could not be contested. The conclusion was more nuanced and more useful than that. It was that the F-15, operating within the American system, with the supporting architecture of airborne warning and control, data links, electronic support, and pilots shaped by decades of continuous combat experience, represented a challenge that their existing tactics and assumptions were not fully equipped to handle, and that changes were required. Let us talk about those changes in detail, because the tactical evolution that followed the Syrian experience is as revealing as the encounters that prompted it. The first area of change involved what Russian doctrine calls the radio-electronic struggle. This is roughly equivalent to what Western militaries call electronic warfare, but the Russian conception is broader. It encompasses not just the jamming and disruption of enemy sensors, but the broader contest over the electromagnetic environment, including the management of your own emissions to deny the enemy information. Following the Syrian experience, Russian tactical aviation began placing greater emphasis on what you could call emission discipline. The idea is simple, but the execution is demanding. You use your active sensors selectively. You make deliberate choices about when the information you gain from turning on your radar is worth the information you give the enemy about your location. You use your passive systems, your infrared search and track, your electronic support measures more extensively to build a picture before you illuminate yourself. This sounds straightforward, but it runs against some deep habits of mind that are built into fighter pilot culture. Turning on your radar gives you clarity, it gives you confidence, it gives you data. Keeping it off requires you to operate with ambiguity, to trust your other systems, to accept uncertainty for tactical reasons. That is a discipline that has to be trained, and it requires a genuine shift in how pilots are prepared for high-end combat. The second area of change involved formation tactics and mutual support geometry. American F-15 pilots, operating with the data link networks that gave them a shared picture of the tactical environment, could coordinate with each other in ways that made their formations behave almost like a single entity, with distributed sensors. Each aircraft in the formation knew what every other aircraft in the formation knew, almost instantly. They could maneuver with a degree of coordination that made the formation itself a weapon, not just a collection of individual platforms. Russian aircraft had data link capability, but the architecture and the integration were not at an equivalent level. The response, as Russian doctrine began to evolve, involved placing greater emphasis on communication procedures and formation geometry designed to provide mutual support without relying on perfect real-time data sharing. Larger spacing between aircraft to prevent simultaneous targeting, careful altitude management to complicate targeting geometry, more deliberate coordination of maneuvers to ensure that any engagement forced on one aircraft would immediately bring other aircraft into position to respond. The third area, and perhaps the most significant, was the recognition that pilot training needed to evolve to account for the specific characteristics of the American system. Not just the F-15 as an aircraft, but the F-15 as a component of an integrated operational system. This meant training against realistic representations of the American beyond visual range engagement envelope, accounting for the data link architecture, accounting for the supporting airborne warning and control capability, accounting for the emission exploitation the Americans could perform. It meant being honest in training about the conditions under which Russian aircraft and Russian pilots would find themselves disadvantaged, so that those conditions could be anticipated and prepared for, rather than encountered as surprises in actual combat. This kind of honest training is harder than it sounds. There is an institutional tendency in any military organization to design training that confirms existing doctrine rather than testing it. Training that puts pilots in genuinely difficult situations, where the scenario is built to expose weaknesses rather than showcase strengths, requires a particular kind of professional courage from the people designing and running the training. The Russian Air Force's willingness to conduct that kind of honest assessment after Syria is, in a real sense, an indicator of professional seriousness. Now let us talk about the F-15E Strike Eagle, because the story over Syria was not only about air superiority. The F-15E was also operating in that environment, in its intended role as a precision strike aircraft, and its performance added its own dimensions to the Russian assessment. The F-15E is what happens when you take the airframe that was designed to be the ultimate air superiority fighter and figure out how to make it carry a massive weapons payload for precision ground attack without losing the air-to-air capability that makes it survivable. The result is one of the most capable strike aircraft ever built. It carries lantern and sniper targeting pods for precision laser-guided and GPS-guided weapons delivery. It can carry up to 23,000 pounds of ordnance. It has a two-person crew, a pilot and a weapons systems officer, allowing a division of labor that makes it extremely effective at the demanding task of prosecuting ground targets while managing the air-to-air environment simultaneously. Over Syria, the F-15E was conducting strike missions with a precision and a tempo that impressed observers from multiple countries. The ability to find, identify, and engage targets with the accuracy and reliability that the F-15E demonstrated is a product of not just the aircraft's sensors and weapons, but again, the pipeline of experience. The weapons systems officers flying in those back seats had accumulated thousands of hours of experience with the targeting systems on that aircraft. They knew its capabilities and its limitations in intimate detail. They had refined their procedures through years of operational use. The result was a combat effectiveness that was visible to anyone paying attention. Russian military observers watching F-15E operations over Syria were collecting information that fed into a broader reassessment of American strike capabilities that paralleled the reassessment of American air superiority capabilities driven by the F-15C encounters. The picture that emerged was of an American tactical aviation system operating at a level of integrated effectiveness that exceeded what prior Russian assessments had projected. Not dramatically, not in ways that suggested American technological dominance was so complete as to be insurmountable, but meaningfully, in ways that demanded a serious and honest response. There is another dimension of the Syrian encounter that deserves attention, because it touches on something that goes beyond the tactical and into the strategic. When Russian aircraft and American aircraft were operating in the same airspace, there were moments when the interaction went beyond passive observation. There were intercepts. There were situations where Russian aircraft maneuvered in close proximity to American aircraft in ways that were clearly intended to communicate something, to assert presence, to demonstrate capability, to test reactions. These interactions were not combat, but they were not entirely separate from combat either. They were part of a continuous process of assessment on both sides. In those interactions, what American pilots demonstrated and what Russian pilots observed was a level of composure and tactical discipline that reinforced the impressions from the less direct encounters. American pilots responding to close approaches by Russian aircraft were flying with a control of their aircraft and a management of the tactical situation that was professional in a way that communicated something specific. It communicated that they were not rattled, that they understood exactly what was happening, that they had options and they knew it, that the Russians were not generating uncertainty in the Americans, they were generating information for the Americans about Russian capabilities and procedures, and that information was being collected, processed, and used. One former American F-15 pilot described what that kind of composure is built on. It is not bravado, it is not indifference to danger, it is the product of training so thorough and so demanding that the pilot's responses in complex tactical situations are not reactive. They are deliberate. The panic responses that kill pilots in combat are the product of encountering something you have not trained for, something that exceeds your prepared responses and forces you into improvisation under extreme stress. American F-15 pilots had been prepared for high-end air combat encounters, including encounters with advanced Russian aircraft, in enough depth and detail that they were operating from a foundation of genuine competence. Not assumptions, not hope, competence. And Russian pilots observing them could see it. Let us step back and look at the larger context, because the Syria encounters did not happen in isolation. They happened in a period when both Russia and the United States were simultaneously reassessing each other's capabilities across every domain of military competition. Russia's actions in Ukraine, beginning with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, had already prompted a significant shift in American and NATO thinking about the nature of the potential threat. Syria added a new data set. It provided a real operational environment in which systems, concepts, and people were being tested against something approaching real conditions. And both sides were learning. For Russia, the lessons from Syria fed into a much broader program of modernization and doctrinal revision that was already underway. The Russian military had been investing heavily in advanced systems since the early 2010s. The Su-57, Russia's fifth-generation stealth fighter, was in development. New versions of air-to-air missiles were being developed and fielded. Electronic warfare systems were being upgraded. The experience in Syria, including the experience of encountering advanced American aircraft in real operational conditions, accelerated and refined some of those development and procurement priorities. It added specific, concrete operational feedback to programs that had previously been driven more by theoretical requirements and design competition between bureaus. The assessment of the F-15 that came out of Syria was not a simple verdict. It was not a declaration that the F-15 was invincible or that Russian aircraft could not compete. It was a professional judgment by professionals who flew against it and alongside it and observed it operating at high levels of effectiveness. That judgment was, this aircraft, in this system, with these pilots, represents a genuine and serious capability gap that requires a genuine and serious response. Not panic, not despair. A professional response built on honest assessment and rigorous action. That kind of judgment is, in a paradoxical way, a tribute to both sides. It is a tribute to the F-15, to the American pilots who fly it, and to the system that surrounds and supports it. And it is a tribute to the Russian pilots and the Russian institution that could look at an uncomfortable experience and respond to it with honesty rather than denial. Now let us talk about what the F-15 means going forward. Because the Syria encounters happened at a specific moment, with specific variants of the F-15. And the story did not stop there. The F-15EX, the latest variant of the Eagle, represents a generational update to a platform that was already formidable. New radar, the APG-82 Active Electronically Scanned Array, which provides capabilities well beyond anything the earlier variants carried. New electronic warfare systems integrated into the airframe from the ground up, an open architecture cockpit that allows software updates to be applied rapidly as the threat environment evolves. A structural service life that could extend the aircraft's operational use well into the 2040s. And the ability to carry more ordnance than any previous F-15 variant, including the capacity to carry and potentially employ hypersonic weapons as they enter service. The F-15EX also incorporates fly-by-wire controls in a system that the original F-15 did not have. This changes how the aircraft flies at the edges of its envelope, providing a level of departure resistance and handling quality refinement that makes an already capable aircraft even more capable in the hands of pilots who may not have the thousands of hours that the most experienced aviators accumulated in earlier variants. The introduction of the F-15EX, against the backdrop of the F-35 entering service in larger numbers, creates an American tactical aviation picture that poses different problems for potential adversaries than the one that existed in 2015 and 2016 over Syria. The F-35 brings stealth. It brings sensor fusion that is genuinely revolutionary in what it provides the pilot, but it brings those capabilities at the cost of payload and some elements of raw performance. The F-15EX brings no stealth, but it brings enormous payload, exceptional range, extreme speed, and a combat record. The combination of the two, operating together, with the F-35 using its stealth and sensor fusion to create the situational awareness picture, and the F-15EX providing the weapons capacity to prosecute targets at range and volume, is a complementary system that addresses different aspects of the problem of achieving air dominance. Russian tactical analysts studying that combination have a different problem set than their predecessors, who only had to think about the F-15 in isolation. And that is precisely the point. American air power never stopped evolving. The experiences over Syria, from the American side, were also generating lessons and driving refinements. Not because the F-15 was performing poorly, it was not. But because the operational environment in Syria was providing real data about real conditions, and that data was being collected, analyzed, and applied. The debrief is never really over in a military that is serious about its business. Every engagement, every encounter, every operation generates information. The organizations that extract the most learning from that information are the ones that improve the fastest. And in the context of the Syria encounters, both sides were in that process. The difference was in the starting point, in the accumulated experience that each side brought to the table, and in the gap between expectation and reality that the encounters revealed. For the Russian pilots who first encountered the F-15 over Syria and found it to be more formidable than their pre-deployment assessments had fully prepared them for, what they experienced was the difference between knowing about something and knowing something. You can read every report about the F-15. You can study every engagement it has been involved in. You can understand its specifications, its weapons, its tactics, its training doctrine, and then you can meet it in the air, in a real environment where the consequences are real, and discover that understanding it intellectually and encountering it operationally are two different things. The margin between the two is the margin that the record is built on, 100-0. In the entire history of the F-15 in air-to-air combat, the aircraft has never been shot down. The pilots who have met it over the decades, from Israeli combat operations in the 1980s, through the Gulf War, through Kosovo, through Iraq, through Syria, have all contributed to that record, by either shooting down adversaries or by creating the tactical conditions in which adversaries chose not to engage. Both outcomes serve the same purpose: air superiority, uncontested control of the airspace over any battlefield where the F-15 is operating. That record is not an accident. It is not luck. It is the product of a deliberate, decades-long investment in getting the whole equation right. The aircraft, the weapons, the sensors, the supporting architecture, the training pipeline, and the culture of professional excellence that demands honest assessment even when the assessment is uncomfortable. The Russian pilots who encountered the F-15 over Syria and brought back honest reports were serving that same principle. They looked at what they saw, they told the truth about it, and they began the work of responding to it. That is what professionals do. And the F-15, nearly 50 years into its operational life, is still the aircraft that forces that response. Still the aircraft that makes opposing air forces revise their assumptions and change their tactics. Still the aircraft that, when the debrief ends and the pilots sit down and try to explain to the next generation what they need to understand before they fly into that sky, gets described in terms that make clear exactly what is at stake. There is a moment in every honest debrief, every genuine after-action review, when the tactical details fall away, and what remains is something simpler and more fundamental. Something that experienced combat pilots know and junior pilots have to learn, sometimes the hard way. It is the recognition that the difference between surviving and not surviving in high-end air combat is measured in seconds and margins and preparation. That the aircraft that gave you an extra 2 seconds of awareness, the training that gave you one more option when the geometry closed in, the data link that showed you the threat before you would otherwise have seen it. Any one of these things can be the difference between the two possible outcomes. The F-15 exists at the intersection of all of those factors. It always has. And over the Syrian sky, in encounters that most people never read about in newspaper headlines, Russian pilots discovered that this was still true. That what had been built in the 1970s, refined through the 1980s and 1990s, combat tested through decades of real operations, and continuously updated to meet the evolving threat, was still what it had always been: the most capable air superiority fighter ever to enter operational service. The one with the undefeated record, the one that changed how its adversaries thought about their tactics, the one that, when you meet it in the air over a contested battlefield, makes you understand why that record exists. The sky over Syria was many things. It was a humanitarian catastrophe. It was a proxy battlefield for competing geopolitical interests. It was a complex, dangerous, constantly shifting environment where decisions made in fractions of seconds had consequences that lasted much longer. It was also a classroom, a place where real systems and real people were tested against real conditions, and where the lessons extracted from that testing flowed back into the doctrines and training programs and development priorities of every major air force paying attention. The Russian pilots who encountered the F-15 over Syria were paying attention. They went home with something more valuable than any intelligence report could have given them. They went home with knowledge. Knowledge earned the way it has always been earned in aviation. In the air, against the real thing, with everything on the line. And what they did with that knowledge, the changes it drove, the revisions it prompted, the honest reckoning with the gap between expectation and reality, that is the story that does not make the headlines, but shapes everything that happens in the sky above every future battlefield. The F-15 did not fire a single shot to change Russian tactical thinking over Syria. It did not need to. It simply showed up, did what it has always done, and